Beetlejuice Beetlejuice. That's right. I said it twice. The long awaited sequel to Tim Burton's classic horror comedy is finally upon us. This one reunites most of the cast to tell yet another surreal story involving the Dietz family. In this one, it's been 36 years since the events of the last film, and the Dietz family returned to Winter River because of Charles Dietz's unexpected death. I think he was the only one that didn't return, right? Other than Alec Baldwin and Gina Davis.
Other than Catherine O'Hara's friends from the first one, the one that she invited over for a dinner party and they do the Calypso song. Other than that, I think everybody else was around.
Yeah, Jeffrey Jones, who plays the original grandfather, is killed off on screen in a stop motion animation sequence, which I thought was a very clever way of doing it. They don't just go, oh, granddad's dead, let's go to a funeral. Tim Burton does a very cool stop motion sequence, which is very, very Tim Burton. So the story for this is that they gather for his funeral. The new character here being Jenna Ortega, who plays Winona Ryder's daughter, Astrid Dietz. And of course, when they return home to Winter River, strange things start happening because it feels like Beetlejuice hasn't quite given up on his obsession with Lydia Dietz. His 36-year-old obsession with Lydia Dietz. That said, there's a bunch of other stuff that happens in this movie as well. It's not just Beetlejuice trying to marry Winona Ryder. There are a huge number of subplots involving Astrid and her boyfriend, Willem Dafoe, who was a washed-up B-movie actor who is now an enforcement cop in the underworld, as in the undead underworld. There's Justin Theroux, who plays Rory, who is Lydia's current boyfriend slash fiance, who's got so many red flags. Monica Bellucci is in this as a bride dressed in black. There's a ton of stuff happening in this movie. And let me tell you, it feels like a real throwback. And I would say premium, A-grade Tim Burton.
Yeah, I mean, this feels like Tim Burton back at his best, right? It's got all the hallmarks of a Tim Burton film. I think the camera work is truly peak 1980s Tim Burton. His use of music, his use of the aforementioned stop motion animation, his use of practical effects and practical monsters, all of that is peak Tim Burton. However, what I found the most strange about this that felt the least Tim Burton was that the story didn't feel as focused as it should have been or needed to be. I think you mentioned earlier that there's a lot of B, C, D, E plots here, and that felt like there were one too many plots here. The Monica Bellucci thing didn't really pan out to anything. Justin Theroux's character was mostly just a punching bag and a joke. There was also this thing about how Winona Ryder is actually maybe psychic, and there was a bit early in the film, but it then never gets addressed again. There's too many small stories here that I found it really annoying. The way it was structured felt like it was a 10-episode TV series mashed into a 2-hour film, because they've got all these subplots that just show up and end just to get our characters to another spot.
No, I totally agree with you. I think he does try to cram far too much into its very short runtime, mind you, which I am grateful for, because I think if it had gone on for any longer, it would have been quite draggy. Now, they didn't try and overuse Beetlejuice. Apparently, Michael Keaton's screen time in this one as Beetlejuice is no more than what he had in the last movie. So it's still very much focused on the Dietz. However, I think they did spend a lot of time trying to develop what happens in the undead underworld. And maybe there was too much plot involving the underworld.
Yeah.
Yes, this is still very much the Dietz's storyline, but that was a little bit of a distraction, and I think that's what made it feel like that there was far too much going on. But you're right about that assessment, and you're right about that analogy of it feeling like an 8 or a 10 episode TV show that's been crammed into this movie that's just slightly over 90 minutes.
Yeah.
There's a lot to love about this movie, though. I mean, those nitpicks, those narrative nitpicks aside, It was great. So great hearing a Danny Elfman score again. I think the music was absolutely fantastic and spot on. I think if you enjoyed Beetlejuice, all of those elements are there without necessarily feeling too fan servicey. They have this usual song and dance numbers. Michael Keaton is just on top form. It's like 36 years haven't passed. He slipped back into the role. It's also been a long time since we've seen Michael Keaton do comedy, so much so that there is an entire generation of people that forget that Michael Keaton started off as a comic actor.
Yeah.
And that was the reason people were so apprehensive about him doing Batman, because they were like, oh, well, what's a comedian going to do playing Bruce Wayne?
Yep.
Tim Burton hasn't had any big hits per se. I mean, Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children was all right. It wasn't great. Dumbo was just another live action remake that we didn't really need. And Beetlejuice really feels like him having fun. Like, it is one of those things where, despite the narrative issues that you and I were talking about, he would do something in this movie and I'd be like, yes. Like, that's the moment where I'd go, oh, this is from what they would call the twisted imagination of Tim Burton. I'm like, yes,
Right.
That's what I'm looking for. And that's what I don't get. Like, that seamless blend between musical, live action, weird fucking comedy, stop motion animation is something that he can pull off in a way that feels so natural. That was my biggest takeaway from watching Beetlejuice. I forgot how you could have all these disparate elements and still have it work. And there were moments when I was laughing out loud.
It feels like only Tim Burton can do a movie that's got all these different, not just stories, but these different forms of storytelling in one piece, and not feel like you need an episode change in between, right? You don't need a break to come back to watch an animated sequence. No, Tim Burton knows how to do it.
Yes.
And that never feels out of place in any of the stuff that he's done. However, I still think that all those disparate stories make this weaker than it actually is as a whole.
After watching this, it's not one of those moments where I go, ugh, they've ruined something great.
Oh, yeah.
They should have just left it alone. However, I think I would call it a Beetlejuice light, or a lightweight sequel to a great, unique, interesting fantasy horror.
I'm currently leaning a little more of like, did they need to do this? I agree they didn't ruin the Beetlejuice brand, the Beetlejuice name. Like, I still love the original even after seeing this. Like, this hasn't sullied my thoughts and my emotions of the original. But after seeing this, I'm like, would I have been happier not having this exist in the world?
For me, the answer is no. Because I think there was still enough interesting and unique elements in this film that made me go, it's nice to see them back. I like where they took Lydia's story. I thought Jenna Ortega's Astrid was very interesting, and unlike what the trailer presented, because the trailer presented her as just Winona Ryder, but by Jenna Ortega.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that character. As the movie moves on, you realize that no, Astrid's a different person and has her own interesting arc. All of that stuff really worked for me, and so I wasn't unhappy that this thing exists.
Right.
Let me put it this way. I wasn't unhappy that this thing existed. However, my life isn't changed by it. If it didn't exist, my life would go on and I would be completely fine. But I think I like that it exists simply because Tim Burton gets to be Tim Burton again.
Yeah.
It's not all out monster kitsch, but it's really, really close.
Yeah.
Also, just a reminder that Michael Keaton is 73 years old now. And he was nimble and just fucking nailing it.
He looked like he was having a lot of fun again. Like, after seeing him as Batman again and reading all the interviews of him talking about the Batgirl situation and how he was just talking about how it's just a paycheck for him and all that, it's nice to see him in a role where he can just sort of like jiggle his waist and have a little bit of fun with it.
Even listening to that Batgirl interview and how it was just a paycheck, I think he's just at that stage in his life where he just wants to do what he wants to do. People went, hey, you want to do Batman again? He's like, sure, that sounds like fun. Let's do Batman. A special shout out, though, to Willem Dafoe, who also seemed like he was having the time of his life.
Yeah.
And every time he came on screen, that B movie, B actor sensibility just made me laugh out loud. Whenever he looked directly at the camera and started talking at you, it was gold. And everything else is just up to Tim Burton's mark lah. The makeup is fantastic. I think the character designs are great. Willem Dafoe's little headpiece where it exposes a little bit of his brain is just superb. The whole sequence with the Beetlejuice baby was disgusting and amazing. For me, there was enough here that kept me excited. It is by no means a great movie, but I would say that it is a solid 7 out of 10.
Agreed. Yeah, especially if you're a fan of the original, I think this is, yeah, it's worth a watch. I don't know if people who watch this first will want to go back and watch the original. I think you should. I think if you haven't seen the original, whether you watch that one first or this one doesn't matter. But I think the first Beetlejuice is just a moment in cinematic history that is important to be seen because of what Tim Burton does to storytelling, right?
On the one note, I echo your sentiment that you can watch this movie as a standalone without having watched the first, and you will still enjoy it for what it is. But like you, I urge people to go and watch that original. I think you need to know where this comes from, and I think it is a landmark. It is a masterpiece in Tim Burtonness, if not just cinema. So it's definitely worth your time. It's definitely worth checking out. And once you see that, actually, that's what I recommend. This thing opens in Malaysian cinemas on Thursday. Beetlejuice, the original, is showing on HBO, which you can watch on the app. I strongly recommend that you check it out. It's not a very long movie. It's a very easy movie to get into, and it's a lot of fun. And I'd be curious to know what this generation, if you are of this younger generation, thinks of that movie, whether it's aged well, whether you can still get into it. Because the one thing that stood out for me with regards to Beetlejuice is how Tim Burton made it feel very much like it was of the era. From the way he shot it, from the color grading of the film, from the use of practical effects and very little CGI, I think all of that made it feel like a true sequel. Yes, it's set in the modern era and, Astrid has a cell phone and her mother's texting her and all of that. But for me, what excited me was the movie never got caught up in all of that because it was still very much a movie about people and characters and this small town and less to do with the accoutrements of 2024. And I thought that was a very, very interesting approach in writing such a sequel. Like I said before, Beetlejuice opens in Malaysian cinemas on Thursday, September 5th. Check it out. Let us know what you think. Did you like it? Are you a Tim Burton fan? You know how to reach out, Goggler MY, all of our social media feeds. You can also email us on podcast@goggler.my or send us a WhatsApp on the Goggler hotline, 012-524-5208. Thank you so much for listening. This is the Goggler Podcast.